My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one holding my family together while they barely noticed I existed. I organized every holiday, fixed every problem, sacrificed weekends, money and sleep all to be brushed aside in favor of my brother, the lawyer, and my sister, the doctor. I thought I could live with being invisible until the night of my sister's wedding, when my father raised a glass in front of 200 guests and laughed, calling me the family's doormat. In that moment, something inside me shattered. And what came out wasn't the quiet daughter they expected, but a woman who finally stood up and refused to be walked on ever again. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I grew up in a house in Oak Park, a quiet suburb outside Chicago, with my parents Edward and Linda, my older brother Christopher, and my younger sister Allison. On the outside, we looked like a normal American family. My dad owned a small construction company and carried himself like a man who built everything with his own two hands. My mom stayed home most of my childhood, later working part-time at a local bank. Christopher was the golden boy from the moment he could speak in full sentences. He was smart, articulate, already being nudged toward law school by the time he was 12. Allison was the baby of the family, sweet, polite, the kind of girl teachers adored. My parents loved to call her their little doctor long before she even applied to medical school. And me, I was the middle child. And that's exactly how I felt, somewhere in between, invisible in plain sight. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when I was in high school, working late into the night on essays, while my dad quizzed Christopher on constitutional amendments for debate club, and my mom ironed Allison's choir dress for a performance. Nobody asked me what I was studying. Nobody noticed the stack of honors certificates piling up in my drawer. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that one day I'd prove I was just as worthy of attention as they were. The memory that cuts the deepest is my high school graduation in June 2008. I had worked harder than I thought possible, fighting for every grade, every opportunity, staying up through nights that felt endless. I became valedictorian number 1 in my class. It should have been the proudest moment of my life. I remember standing backstage in my cap and gown, my speech folded neatly in my hands. I kept glancing at the section of the bleachers where my family was supposed to be sitting. The principal introduced me. The applause echoed, and as I walked up to the podium, my eyes searched the crowd. Christopher's seat was empty. Allison's seat was empty. My parents' seats, empty. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile for my classmates and their families, and I gave that speech to a sea of faces that didn't include the 2 people I wanted most to see me. Later that night, I found out why. My parents had driven Christopher 3 hours to an interview event at the University of Michigan Law School. They didn't want him to miss his chance. "We'll make it up to you," they said when they came home, my mom touching my arm gently, my dad looking tired but unapologetic. I nodded like it didn't matter, but inside I felt something crack. I had stood on that stage alone, proving myself, and it hadn't been enough to pull their attention away from Christopher's future. Allison had been at a friend's birthday party. She called me later, chattering about the cake and the decorations, barely acknowledging that I had just graduated at the top of my class. I listened, murmured responses, but I barely heard her. I was still replaying the image of those empty seats. That summer, my dad boasted endlessly to relatives about Christopher's potential law career. My mom shared stories of Allison's science fair projects. When relatives asked about me, my dad chuckled, "Rachel's reliable. She keeps things running." Reliable. That was the word. Not brilliant, not ambitious, not successful. Just reliable. One evening, not long after graduation, I sat with my mom on the porch swing. The cicadas hummed in the trees, the air thick with heat. I finally asked her why they hadn't come. She sighed, her eyes fixed on the yard. "You're stronger than they are, Rachel. You can handle disappointment better. Christopher needed us." I wanted to scream, to shake her, and ask why my achievements never seemed to count. Instead, I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. She reached over and patted my hand. "You're the strong one," she whispered. But in her eyes I saw it. That flicker of guilt she quickly smothered, and behind it the same favoritism I had always felt. I carried that night with me for years. It was the moment I realized I could be at the very top and still not be enough for them. It was the moment I understood what being invisible in my own family truly meant. And yet even then, some stubborn part of me kept hoping one day they would see me. Really see me not as the helper or the reliable one, but as their daughter who deserved to be celebrated too. That hope stayed with me quietly like a shadow as I stepped into adulthood. When I left Oak Park for Northwestern in 2010, I carried more than my acceptance letter and a suitcase. I carried that sense of being overlooked, the sting of empty seats at my graduation, and the determination to prove myself on my own terms. I had won a full scholarship, something I fought tooth and nail for because I knew my parents' money and attention were already spoken for. They poured thousands into Christopher's law school tuition and helped Allison chase her dream of medicine. For me, there were no checks slipped into envelopes, no savings accounts whispered about. I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to find a way to pay for it myself. At Northwestern, I juggled classes with shifts at the Student Center Cafe and weekend tutoring gigs. I remember standing behind the counter, my hands aching from brewing lattes while skimming through flashcards for marketing exams. My friends would talk about their parents visiting, taking them out for dinners on Michigan Avenue. My parents didn't visit me once. When I asked, Dad would say, "We've been swamped with Christopher's moot court competition." Mom would add, "And Allison has exams too, you know." It stung, but I smiled through it. By 2014, I graduated with honors job offer in hand from a Chicago tech firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. While Christopher announced his summer associate position at a prestigious downtown firm, my parents beamed like he had already won the Supreme Court. When Allison shared she had gotten into med school, they threw a dinner in her honor. When I moved into my first tiny apartment in Lincoln Park, I paid for a small housewarming myself. They came but spent most of the night asking Christopher about cases and Allison about rotations. I remember standing in my own kitchen holding out trays of hors d'oeuvres, listening as my dad told a cousin Rachel's place is nice, but the real stars are the lawyer and the doctor. Still, I built something for myself. By 2016, I had scraped and saved enough for a modest condo on the north side. Signing those papers felt like the first time I wasn't just surviving. I was creating stability. No one congratulated me. Instead, my father said, "Well, now you'll have room to host Thanksgiving." Perfect. I laughed weakly, realizing he wasn't joking. That year, I organized Thanksgiving for 20 relatives. I cooked, cleaned, decorated, and when everyone left, I stayed up until 2 and scrubbing dishes alone. The next morning, my mom called to say dinner was wonderful. "You really make things easier for the family." Easier. Always easier, never celebrated. Allison leaned on me constantly. During her residency, she'd call at the last minute. "Rach, can you watch Emma and Jacob tonight? My babysitter canceled, and I've got a double shift." I rearranged dates, skipped work dinners, and sat on her couch reading bedtime stories. I loved my niece and nephew, but each time I tucked them in, I wondered why Allison never seemed to see the sacrifice. Once I hinted, "You know it's tough to keep changing my schedule." She brushed it off. "You're so good with kids and the little ones love you. You're the best, Rachel." It sounded like a compliment, but it was just another way to trap me in that role. Christopher wasn't much better. In 2017, he asked to borrow $5,000 for a down payment on a car. He promised to pay me back within 6 months. It's 2020 now, and I've never seen a cent. When I brought it up once, he laughed, clapped me on the shoulder, and said, "You make good money and you'll be fine." My parents sided with him. "Christopher is working so hard, Rachel." Mom said, "Don't pressure him. The pattern never broke." Every Christmas, Easter, and birthday became my responsibility. I ordered catering, sent invitations, decorated the house, even cleaned up afterward. My father would boast to guests about Christopher's big cases and Allison's medical miracles. When people asked about me, he'd say, "Rachel keeps the trains running on time. She's reliable." Reliable. That word hung over me like a chain. The lowest point came in 2019 for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. I spent 3 weeks planning every detail of a grand party at a banquet hall in Naperville. I coordinated with vendors, ordered custom flowers, put together a slideshow of their decades together. I used up nearly all my vacation days to prepare. The night of the party, the hall was glowing. The guests were laughing, and I was running around in heels, fixing last-minute issues. I thought maybe this time they'll see what I've done. When my parents arrived, Christopher swept in behind them carrying a single bottle of French wine. It was expensive, I'll admit that. He handed it to Dad, who lit up like a child at Christmas. "Christopher, you always know the perfect thing." "You shouldn't have." Guests crowded around, praising his thoughtfulness. My mother dabbed her eyes, saying, "We're so lucky to have such devoted children." My father raised his glass and announced to the crowd, "Here's to 40 years and to our brilliant son and daughter. We couldn't be prouder." He turned toward Christopher and Allison, smiling wide. I stood there, 3 weeks of work behind me, sweat still on my neck, holding a tray of champagne flutes. My father's words echoed brilliant son, brilliant daughter. I was invisible again. A relative asked about the decorations, and Dad waved it off. "It's all thanks to teamwork." "But you know Christopher even brought wine from France." That night as I drove home, the city lights blurring through the windshield, I clenched the steering wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. The party had been flawless, but all anyone remembered was a bottle of wine. I pulled into my condo's parking lot, sat in the dark, and let the tears finally come. I realized I could pour myself out completely for this family, give them every ounce of energy, every penny of savings. And still I would never be more than the background character in their story. I thought back to my mom's words years earlier. "You're the strong one." Maybe strength was just another excuse for neglect. Maybe being the strong one meant you didn't get to be celebrated, you only got to hold everyone else up. And sitting there in my car, mascara streaking down my face, I wondered how much longer I could keep doing it. It was a cold Sunday afternoon in January 2024 when Allison called a family meeting at my parents' house in Oak Park. I drove over reluctantly, expecting another lecture about pitching in more for holidays, but when I stepped inside, I found balloons tied to the staircase, and my mom beaming ear to ear. Allison and her boyfriend Mark were standing in the living room holding hands, her left ring finger sparkling under the overhead lights. "I'm engaged," she squealed, waving her hand. My parents rushed to hug her, their voices overlapping in excitement. "This is the biggest moment of our family's life," Dad declared, as if her engagement was some kind of national holiday. "The event of the decade," Mom whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Christopher clapped Mark on the back, already bragging about his future brother-in-law's career in finance. Meanwhile, I stood a few steps behind, holding my coat, invisible again. Allison turned to me with a wide grin. "You'll be my maid of honor, right?" she asked. For a second my chest lifted. Maybe she wanted me by her side in a real way. But then she added, her voice shifting into that condescending tone I knew too well. "You're so good at this kind of stuff. You can handle the details. I'm way too busy at the hospital." The words stung more than I expected. I forced a smile. "Sure, Allison." From that moment, my role in her wedding was clear, not the honored sister, but the unpaid wedding planner. Within a week, she sent me a spreadsheet of tasks. Call the wedding planner, confirm the church in River Forest, book the ballroom at the Palmer House downtown, order invitations, coordinate hotel blocks for the out-of-town guests, handle seating charts for all the extended cousins. I stared at the email in disbelief. It was pages long, and every single item was under my name. I called her that evening. "Allison, don't you think maybe you and Mark should be handling some of this? Or at least splitting it up?" She laughed. "Rachel, you've always been so good at this. Remember Mom and Dad's anniversary party Thanksgiving last year? You just have a knack for making things work. Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without you." She said it like a compliment, but the message was clear. I was expected to carry the weight. The following weekends became a blur of appointments. I met with the florist on a snowy Saturday morning, shivering in my boots, while Allison sent texts from the hospital. I toured the ballroom with the hotel manager, nodding as he rattled off numbers that made my head spin. I sat at my kitchen table late at night, cross-referencing guest lists and hotel availability, my laptop surrounded by sticky notes and empty coffee cups. When I tried to involve Allison, she brushed me off. "I'm too swamped with patience right now." "You've got this." If I pressed, her tone sharpened. "Honestly, Rachel, don't make this harder than it needs to be." One evening, after I spent hours finalizing invitation proofs, I called her again, hoping for at least a thank you. Instead, she sighed into the phone. "Make sure the font isn't too small, and please double-check the spelling of Mark's parents' names. I don't want any embarrassing mistakes." "You're detail-oriented, right?" Her words landed like a slap. Detail-oriented. A doormat disguised as a perfectionist. The worst came 2 weeks later when we gathered at my parents' house to go over the seating chart. I had spread out the papers on the dining table, carefully labeling each table with sticky notes. Allison breezed in late, still in her scrubs, her engagement ring glinting under the chandelier. She glanced at the chart, barely looking. "Looks fine," she said casually, then added with a smirk. "You really are good at these little chores. Honestly, Rachel, that's what you're best at, handling the small stuff so the rest of us can focus on the big picture." The room went quiet. My parents didn't flinch. Christopher chuckled under his breath. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "These aren't small things, Allison. This is your wedding. I'm spending hours making sure it's perfect." She shrugged, sipping from a glass of wine she'd just poured. "Well, someone has to do it. And you're great at this kind of thing. It's your lane, you know." Her words sliced through me. My lane, as if my place in the family had been paved long ago. Background work, invisible effort, silent sacrifice. I wanted to scream to demand someone acknowledge me, but instead I gathered the seating charts, stacked them neatly, and swallowed my pride. That night, driving back to my condo through the frozen streets, I replayed her voice in my head. "You're great at these little chores. It's your lane." The phrase looped like a cruel refrain. For years, I had convinced myself that if I worked hard enough, if I gave enough one day, they would see me differently. But maybe Allison had just said the truth out loud. In their eyes, I was never going to be anything more. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the stoplights blurred red against the icy windshield. Something inside me shifted, not broken but strained like a rope pulled too far. And though I didn't know it yet, that rope would snap sooner than anyone imagined. By February, my life had become a series of calendars and checklists. I'd clock out of work at 7, answer a dozen emails from clients, then dive straight into Allison's wedding tasks. My boss at Westview Tech had pulled me aside more than once, asking if I was overcommitting. I smiled, assured him everything was under control, and then burned through my vacation days to make space for endless vendor calls. The first disaster hit on a gray Thursday morning. I drove across town to meet the wedding planner at the florist. I'd chosen ivory roses and pale lavender hydrangeas, simple but elegant. When the samples arrived, the bouquets were garish, deep red and bright yellow clashing so badly they looked like a circus. "This isn't what we agreed on," I told the planner, my voice sharp. He shrugged, fiddling with his phone. "It's what the wholesaler delivered. We'll sort it out." That night, I sat at my parents' kitchen table, still fuming. Allison strolled in after her shift, dropped her bag, and glanced at the photos I'd taken. "Those look terrible," she said flatly. "Why didn't you make sure it was right?" I stared at her. I did. I gave clear instructions. They messed up. Dad folded his arms. "Rachel, details matter. If you were on top of it, this wouldn't have happened." Mom stayed quiet, sipping her tea. Something inside me bristled. "So it's my fault the florist can't tell ivory from red," Allison shot back. "You're supposed to be handling these things. If you can't, maybe you shouldn't have agreed to be maid of honor." I wanted to scream. Instead, I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. At midnight, I opened my laptop and started emailing every florist within 50 miles. By 2 a.m., I had 3 quotes and a tentative replacement. I collapsed onto my couch exhausted, knowing no one would thank me. 2 weeks later came the chairs. At the ballroom walk-through, the rentals delivered clunky wooden chairs with scratched paint. The contract clearly specified Chiavari chairs gold with ivory cushions. The planner barely glanced at the mistake. "It's just a placeholder. They'll fix it," I snapped. "We're paying thousands for this. Placeholders aren't good enough." That night at dinner, Dad sighed. "Why do you always make things difficult, Rachel? These vendors work hard." "They're not doing what we paid for," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. Allison smirked over her wine. "Maybe you should have checked the order." Again. I clenched my fork so tightly my knuckles ached. The next morning, the vendor emailed demanding additional fees for rush replacements. The planner passed the invoice to me. "You'll need to sign this guarantee." "What, I'm not the bride? I'm not the one with the contract. Allison and Mark are busy. You're the contact. Someone has to take responsibility." Against my better judgment, I scribbled my name. If something went wrong, I'd be the one stuck with the bill. By March, I was running on coffee and 4 hours of sleep. I'd lie in bed at night, my heart racing, mentally rearranging seating charts. I woke with headaches, my shoulders knotted with tension. One night after I slammed my laptop shut at 2 a.m., David reached over from my couch and touched my hand. "Rachel," he said softly, "you don't have to do all this. It's not your wedding." I rubbed my eyes. "If I don't, who will? They'll let it all fall apart. Maybe that's not your problem." His voice was gentle but firm. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the worry in his eyes. But I couldn't stop. The following weekend, my parents hosted a dinner for some family friends. I stopped by to drop off updated flower samples. As I slipped in through the side door, I heard my father's booming laugh from the living room. "Edward, you're lucky," one of his friends said. "This wedding must be a lot of work." My dad chuckled. "Not really. Our family's a great team. Allison is saving lives at the hospital, Christopher's making strides at the law firm, and Rachel, well, she's always been good at cleaning up, keeping things in order." The room erupted in laughter. I froze in the hallway, clutching the folder of contracts to my chest. Cleaning up? That was what I was reduced to in his story. Not the one keeping the vendors straight, not the one losing sleep to salvage their mistakes. Just the girl with a mop invisible unless something spilled. I backed out quietly, my throat tight. Outside, the spring air was cool against my burning face. I wanted to scream into the night, but instead I sat in my car listening to the sound of my own breath. Somewhere deep inside, the rope holding me together stretched tighter, threatening to snap. The crisp October air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves as I pulled up to St. Mark's Church in River Forest. The white steeple rose against a clear blue sky, bells echoing across the quiet neighborhood. Guests were already gathering on the steps, men adjusting their ties, women clutching bouquets against the wind. I hurried inside, clipboard in hand, scanning the pews to make sure the ushers were ready, the aisle runners straight, the candles lit. From the moment I stepped through the doors, I wasn't Rachel the sister. I was Rachel the coordinator, the fixer. I directed my Uncle Robert to his seat after he stumbled with his program-guided Aunt May to the restroom when she looked lost and double-checked with the organist about the recessional song. By the time I sat down, sweat dampened the back of my dress. Then Allison appeared at the entrance of the church. She was radiant in her lace gown, her hair pulled into a sleek bun, the long veil cascading down her back. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and my parents glowed with pride. My mother clutched her pearls, whispering, "Our little doctor," as though Allison were some kind of saint. My father shook Mark's hand firmly and patted him on the back, proclaiming to nearby guests, "This is the best day of our family's life." When the ceremony began, I sat quietly behind the bridesmaids, my eyes fixed on Allison walking down the aisle with Dad. The sunlight from the stained glass painted colors across her gown. Guests leaned in to snap photos, whispering about how accomplished she was. Dr. Allison Carter, and now Mrs. Whitman. I overheard one woman say with admiration, "Not a single mention of me, the one who had spent months holding the whole thing together." After the vows, we filed into the reception hall across town, a grand ballroom in the Palmer House, Hilton, downtown. The chandeliers sparkled, the tables glittered with ivory linens and gold chairs, the very ones I had fought for after the vendor's blunder. But no one knew that. No one saw me standing on the sidelines watching the waitstaff hustle, praying that every detail held together. I stationed myself near the entry greeting, late guests shaking hands, pointing them toward their tables. "Thank you for coming," I said so many times that my cheeks ached from smiling. Cousins breezed past me with barely a nod, rushing to hug Allison, congratulating Christopher on his latest case at the firm. "You must be so proud of your kids," one guest told my parents, their eyes shining. "A doctor and a lawyer." My father laughed heartily, clapping Christopher on the back. Yes, we're very blessed." My name never crossed his lips. As the cocktail hour stretched on, I carried extra chairs to the table for Grandma Ruth, and her friends fetched water for a diabetic cousin, and made sure the music stayed at a level everyone could tolerate. Every time I looked for acknowledgement, I was met with indifference. Guests kept asking me questions like I was staff. "Where's the coat check? Can you tell me when dinner starts?" No one realized I was the sister of the bride. Then came the family photos. The photographer lined everyone up in front of the grand staircase. I took my place next to Christopher, smoothing my dress, ready to smile. Allison turned and frowned. "Rachel, can you step out? You're throwing off the balance." I froze, heat rushing to my face. "What, I'm part of this family too?" She adjusted her veil, her voice sharp but low. "It'll look better without you. Please don't make this a thing." The photographer glanced nervously between us, waiting. My parents stayed silent. Christopher shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. With the weight of 50 eyes on me, I stepped back, forcing a tight smile. "Fine." I slipped out of the frame, standing just off to the side as the camera flashed. Allison's white gown glowed under the lights. My parents grinned proudly. Christopher stood tall and polished. And me, I stood in the shadows, clutching my purse, invisible. The photographer shouted, "Beautiful, one more shot," as I blinked hard against the sting in my eyes. My vision blurred, and I pressed my nails into my palm to keep from crying. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped into a corner near the bar, pretending to check my phone. I could still hear Allison's voice in my head. "It'll look better without you, better without me." That was the story of my life. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and forced myself back into motion, weaving between tables to make sure everything was running smoothly. If nothing else, I knew my role: the helper, the fixer, the one who made everyone else look good even when I was erased from the picture. The ballroom glittered under the chandeliers, crystal glasses catching the golden light as waiters carried trays of champagne between the tables. The band played softly, the kind of background music that kept conversation humming. I hovered near the back of the room, making sure the dinner service stayed on schedule when the DJ's microphone screeched slightly, signaling the start of speeches. My father rose from the head table, his tuxedo a little too tight around the middle, his face flushed from wine and pride. He tapped his glass with a spoon, the sharp ping cutting through the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate this extraordinary union. We couldn't be prouder of our Allison and her new husband, Mark." Applause thundered through the hall. Allison blushed, lowering her lashes, savoring the adoration. Dad launched into his performance, waving his hands as he spoke. "Now let me tell you, it's no small feat raising 3 children. But look at what we've accomplished. Christopher is thriving as one of Chicago's top attorneys." Guests clapped, some murmuring admiration. Dad went on. "And Allison, our shining star, dedicating her life to saving others as a doctor. We are truly blessed." I clapped politely, waiting for my turn, my chest tight. Then he turned slightly toward me. And of course he said casually, "There's Rachel, our eldest. She's always been dependable, always ready to help out." He smiled as if he'd just given me the highest praise. A few guests looked in my direction, polite nods at best, then turned back to their drinks. Before the awkwardness could settle, Roger, one of Dad's business associates, raised his glass. "Edward, you've got a hell of a family. That's real teamwork right there." a doctor, a lawyer. What more could you ask for? Dad's eyes gleamed and he leaned into the moment, grinning broadly. Oh, absolutely. Our family is the perfect team. Allison saves lives. Christopher wins cases and Rachel... He chuckled, pausing for effect. Rachel's the doormat of the family. She just soaks up all the messes and keeps things running smooth. The room erupted with uneasy laughter, scattered and thin. Some guests forced smiles, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Allison pressed her lips together, a smirk tugging at the corners, clearly amused. I froze. My stomach dropped. My skin prickled hot under the layers of my dress. Doormat. He had said it so easily, so publicly, reducing my 34 years to a household rag for people to wipe their feet on. My fork clattered against my plate, though I hadn't realized I'd set it down. I heard the scrape of a chair, someone coughing into their napkin, the band faltering for a beat before recovering. Christopher chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the tension. Dad, come on, that's a little harsh. But his tone lacked conviction. He wasn't defending me. He was smoothing things over like always. I sat perfectly still, but inside my body was trembling. My heart pounded in my ears, and I wanted the ground to split open to swallow me before anyone could see the tears welling up. I looked at my mother. Linda's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on her lap, her fingers twisting in her napkin. She didn't say a word. The laughter died down. Conversations picked back up, and Dad launched into another anecdote about Christopher's courtroom triumph. The moment passed for everyone else, but for me, it stretched a jagged wound carved in front of 50 witnesses. I forced myself to stand, excusing myself to the restroom. The hallway outside was quiet, the carpet muffling my footsteps. I locked myself in a stall and pressed my palms to the cool metal, breathing hard. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger. Flushed cheeks, eyes shining with anger and humiliation. I dabbed the corners of my eyes with tissue, desperate not to ruin my makeup, but the sting wouldn't go away. When I finally walked back in, the speeches were ending. Ew. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, the band struck up a lively tune. From across the room, Dad caught my eye, lifted his glass and winked as if his little joke had been harmless. My stomach twisted. He didn't even realize the damage he had done. Or worse, he did, and he didn't care. I slipped back into my seat, silent, invisible, a prop at my sister's wedding. But inside, something shifted. The word doormat echoed in my head sharper each time. Doormat, always there, always useful, never valued. For years I had let them trample me, but as the laughter of the crowd blurred into white noise, I knew a reckoning was coming. And it would not be me who stayed silent much longer. The microphone felt heavier than it should have, my palms slick against the cool metal as I rose from my chair. A murmur passed through the tables. Glasses paused midway to lips, forks set down. I cleared my throat, my voice trembling as I forced the words out. "You're right, Dad," I began. My eyes locked on him, though my knees shook. I have been the family's doormat for 34 years. Always there, always dependable, but doormats only serve a purpose when people keep wiping their feet on them. My voice steadied, rising with each word. From tonight on, don't expect me to carry this family anymore. The ballroom went still, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Even the band had quieted. I felt every pair of eyes on me. My breath caught, but then anger surged, carrying me forward. Let me remind everyone what this doormat has done. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday for the past decade, I planned them. The decorations, the food, the cleanup. When Grandma Ruth got sick, who drove her to every doctor's appointment, me. When Allison needed someone to watch Emma and Jacob at the last minute, who dropped everything to help me. When Christopher asked for a loan for his car, who handed over $5,000 that's still unpaid. Me. And this wedding. I held up the clipboard I had kept tucked under my chair, the pages curled at the edges. Every contract, every vendor, every crisis. When the florist delivered the wrong colors, when the chairs were wrong, who fixed it? Me, with my time, with my money. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman at the next table whispered, "Poor thing." Another shook her head, murmuring, "That's awful." I felt the strength in my voice growing no longer a tremor but a clear, ringing declaration. "You've all laughed at the joke of me being the helper, the one who keeps things neat, the one who does the little chores. But tonight you turned that into a punchline. You reduced me to a rug for this family to trample on." I scanned the room. Allison sat rigid, her wineglass frozen in her hand, her lips twisted into a tight smile. Christopher shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his cufflinks, avoiding my eyes. My mother stared at me wide-eyed, her napkin clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white. My father's face darkened, his jaw set, though he still tried to smirk as if I were being overly dramatic. I drew in a deep breath, lifted my chin, and spoke the words that had burned inside me for years. "From this moment on, I am no one's doormat. Not yours, not anyone's. I won't be the one you call to fix everything, to sacrifice, to disappear so you can shine. That ends tonight." The silence deepened, almost unbearable. My heart pounded so loud I thought the microphone would catch it. Then came the sound of whispers, soft and uneasy, threading through the tables. I caught snippets. "She's right, I never knew. That's brutal." I set the microphone down gently, the small thud echoing like a gavel. For the first time in my life, I stood taller than the people who had always loomed over me. My hands were steady now, my breathing even. I stepped back from the table, feeling dozens of eyes follow me, some sympathetic, some horrified, all stunned. And in the center of it all, my father's smirk faltered. Allison's face flushed. Christopher stared at the floor, and my mother looked like she might finally break her silence. But I didn't wait for anyone to speak. I let my words hang in the air, heavy and undeniable, the truth laid bare for every guest in that glittering room to hear. "Sit down right now," my father barked, his face blotchy red under the ballroom lights. His voice cracked like a whip slicing through the hush that had fallen over the tables. "You've embarrassed me in front of everyone. On your sister's wedding day, no less. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I turned back slowly, meeting his glare without flinching. My voice was calm, steady, almost quiet, but it carried across the hall. "No, Dad. You embarrassed yourself when you called your own daughter a doormat in front of 200 people." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others fixed their eyes on their plates. I caught sight of my mother, her head bent low, her lips pressed into a tight line. Christopher stepped forward, adjusting his tie, his tone rehearsed and patronizing the way he probably spoke in court. "Rachel, come on. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Dad was joking." Everyone knew that. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "A joke? Tell me, Christopher, when was the last time you were the punchline at these parties? When was the last time Dad reduced your career, your entire existence, to a single insult?" Christopher's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He glanced toward Allison as if silently asking for backup. Allison didn't hesitate. Her voice rang out sharp and smug. "You know what this really is, jealousy. You can't stand that Dad is proud of us. Christopher is a lawyer, I'm a doctor, and you—" she gestured at me with her manicured hand. "You have nothing worth bragging about. That's why you're making a scene. Because deep down you're envious." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I refused to let it twist into shame. I squared my shoulders and spoke clearly, letting my words slice through the noise. "I have a career, Allison. I'm a marketing director at a tech company downtown. I've earned every promotion on my own without a dime of help from Mom or Dad. I bought my own condo at 30-something neither of you did. And I have a partner who respects me not because of my title, but because of who I am. I don't need this family's approval to know my worth." The air thickened, heavy and still. My father's mouth opened as if to shout again, but no words came. Allison's smile faltered just slightly. Christopher's face went blank, a lawyer caught without a defense. For the first time, I didn't feel small under their gaze. I felt taller, stronger, like I had finally stepped out of the shadow I'd been shoved into my whole life. I set the microphone back onto the stand, the thud echoing like punctuation. Then I looked at my family one last time, my father's fury, Allison's contempt, Christopher's discomfort, my mother's silent despair, all frozen like a portrait. "I'm done," I said simply. With that, I turned, lifted my clutch from the chair, and walked across the ballroom. The train of Allison's gown brushed against the polished floor as guests whispered behind their hands. No one tried to stop me. No one reached for me. The doors at the back of the hall swung open, and I stepped into the cool night air. The muffled music and laughter spilled out for a moment before the doors closed again, leaving me in silence under the October sky. My heels clicked against the pavement as I crossed the empty drive, each step pulling me farther from the only role I had ever been allowed to play. I didn't look back. The week after the wedding, I felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over my life. No phone calls begging me to fix seating charts, no frantic late-night emails about vendors. For the first time in months, I woke up without a list of someone else's problems to solve. But silence has a way of being short-lived in my family. News trickled back to me through cousins and coworkers who had been at the reception. People were talking about the speech, about my father's words, about the way I had walked out without looking back. Some relatives sided with me, saying Edward had humiliated me unfairly. Others whispered that I had ruined Allison's big day. Either way, the perfect image of our family had cracked wide open. Christopher called a few days later, his voice tense. He barely mentioned the wedding. Instead, he dove into his own crisis. His firm had tasked him with planning a client appreciation gala at a hotel downtown. Without hesitation, he admitted he was drowning. "I just need you to help me coordinate the vendors, Rach. You're so good at that stuff." I almost laughed. "No, Christopher, I'm not doing this." His tone sharpened. "You're really going to punish me for Dad's words." "This is business. It's your business," I replied. "Handle it yourself." The event came and went, and from what I heard, it was a disaster. The caterer delivered the wrong menu. The seating collapsed into chaos. The keynote speaker left after waiting 40 minutes. Christopher was furious afterward, not just at the humiliation, but at losing any chance at early partnership. For once, his confidence had cracked. Allison's struggles surfaced next. Without me as her fallback babysitter, she scrambled. One Saturday night, I bumped into her at the grocery store, exhaustion etched into her face. Emma clung to her leg. Jacob cried in the cart. She admitted her sitter had canceled 3 weekends in a row. "It's impossible," she muttered, tossing snacks into the cart. "I can't keep paying triple rates for emergency sitters. Mark's working overtime and the kids are wearing me down." I offered nothing but a polite nod. Inside, I felt a strange mix of sympathy and relief. For years, I had sacrificed my weekends to cover for her. Now she was living in the reality she had pushed onto me. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the wedding reached my parents. Edward and Linda had always been the proud hosts at family gatherings, but now whispers followed them. Cousins murmured about that doormat comment, shaking their heads in disapproval. An aunt cornered Linda at church, asking, "Why would Edward say that about Rachel?" It was cruel. My mother's cheeks burned red as she avoided answering. My father brushed it off with bravado, insisting people were too sensitive, but even he couldn't ignore the sidelong glances. 2 weeks later, on a gray Sunday afternoon, I heard a knock on my condo door. When I opened it, my mother stood there bundled in her wool coat, clutching a small tote bag. Her eyes were tired, softer than I remembered. "Can I come in?" she asked. I nodded, stepping aside. We sat at my kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring before finally speaking. "Rachel, I need to say something." I braced myself, expecting another plea to smooth things over. But her voice trembled in a way I had never heard. "I was wrong. I was wrong for so many years. I let you carry everything. I watched your father dismiss you, overlook you, and I stayed quiet. I told myself you were strong enough to handle it. But I see now that was cowardice. I should have stood up for you." The words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like for my mother to acknowledge what I'd endured, but I never truly believed it would happen. My throat tightened. I whispered, "Why now?" She wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. "Because when you walked out of that ballroom, I realized I didn't even know my own daughter anymore. You were so sure, so strong, and I was ashamed that I had let you suffer alone." Tears stung my eyes as I listened. Part of me wanted to pull her into a hug, another part wanted to demand why it had taken 34 years for her to see me. "Mom," I said finally, my voice low, "you let me be invisible. You let me be their doormat." Her face crumpled. "I know, and I can't undo it. But I need you to know. I see you now, and I am so sorry." The room was quiet except for the faint tick of the wall clock. For the first time in decades, my mother admitted the truth. And though forgiveness didn't come easily, something inside me shifted. This was no longer just about the wedding or one cruel word. It was about a lifetime of silence finally breaking. I poured us both tea and we sat together at the table, letting the steam rise between us. The distance between mother and daughter had always felt like a canyon. That day, for the first time, it felt like a bridge might be possible. When spring rolled into Chicago, my world felt startlingly different. I woke each morning with my own agenda instead of my family's emergencies. No frantic phone calls from Allison, no guilt-laden texts from Mom, no sarcastic requests from Christopher. The silence that used to sting now felt liberating, like a blank page I finally had the right to fill. At Westview Tech, my boss called me into his office one Monday. The blinds were open, letting the sunlight spill across his desk. He smiled in that rare, genuine way I'd only seen a few times. "Rachel, we've landed a massive client. A startup out of Fulton Market. Bright, ambitious, they want a full rebrand. I want you to lead it." For a moment, I thought I misheard him. "Me, yes you," he said, sliding the folder across the desk. "You're meticulous. You know how to juggle chaos and still deliver results. Frankly, no one else has your skill set." I walked out holding that folder like it was gold. For weeks, I poured every ounce of energy into that project. Late nights drafting strategy decks, weekends sketching campaign ideas in coffee shops, countless calls with the client's nervous founders. And for once, it wasn't exhausting. It was exhilarating. I wasn't carrying someone else's burden. I was building something that had my name on it. The launch was flawless. The new brand hit social media, the campaign went viral, and within months, the startup doubled its client base. At the quarterly meeting, my boss stood up in front of the entire company and announced my promotion to Director of Marketing. Applause thundered around me, and I felt a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with humiliation. This time, the spotlight was mine. Outside of work, David and I grew closer. He wasn't just the man from my gym anymore. He had become my partner in the truest sense. On Friday nights, we'd cook dinner in my condo, him chopping vegetables while I stirred sauce, the radio humming in the background. Sometimes we'd walk along the lakefront, the city lights flickering on the water, talking about everything from childhood memories to the kind of future we wanted. One night in June, after a long week, we sat on my balcony with glasses of wine. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of lilacs from the neighbor's yard. David reached for my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "You know what I admire most about you?" he asked. I tilted my head. "What?" "The way you stood up at that wedding. You didn't let them define you anymore. That took guts." "I love that about you." The words sank deep, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. No one had ever said they loved me for fighting back. For most of my life, standing up for myself was treated like being difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. But here was a man who saw it as strength, not weakness. I squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick the corners of my eyes. I didn't think anyone noticed. I noticed he said firmly, "And I don't ever want you to forget how powerful that moment was." I looked out at the skyline, the Willis Tower glowing against the night, and for the first time in years, I felt free. free from the endless cycle of being the fixer, free from waiting for scraps of recognition. My time was mine. My energy was mine. On Saturday mornings, instead of babysitting or running errands for my parents, I went to the farmer's market, filling my tote with fresh bread and berries just because I wanted to. I took a pottery class, my hands shaping clay into imperfect bowls that sat proudly on my kitchen counter. I started saying yes to brunch with friends I hadn't seen in years. Life felt wider, fuller, and not once did I feel guilty for choosing myself. The contrast was sharp when I thought of Allison juggling 2 kids and long shifts without me as her safety net, or Christopher licking his wounds after his failed gala. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to swoop in. Their problems weren't mine to solve. That night on the balcony, David leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "Promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll never let anyone make you feel like a doormat again. Not your father, not your siblings, not anyone." I turned to him, the city glowing behind us, and whispered, "I promise." And as his arms wrapped around me, I believed it. For the first time, I truly believed it. One evening in late summer, my phone buzzed with a message from my mom. "Dinner. Just you and me. Tomorrow night? My treat?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, surprised. For years, she had only ever called me when she needed me to host or fix something. Now she wanted to sit down, just us. We met at a small Italian restaurant in Oak Park, one of those cozy places with checkered tablecloths and candles flickering in wine bottles. When I walked in, she was already there, her hair neatly pinned back, a folder resting beside her purse. She stood up to hug me, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Over bread and salad, we made small talk about the weather, the new construction on Madison Street, and the rising prices at the grocery store. But halfway through her pasta, she put her fork down, folded her hands, and looked me straight in the eye. "Rachel," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I enrolled in a certification program at Roosevelt University. Financial planning." I blinked, stunned. "You?" What I realized, she went on, "I've spent most of my life defined by other people. By your father's business, by your brother's law career, by Allison's medical training, by keeping peace, keeping quiet. But watching you stand up at that wedding, watching you walk away, I couldn't stop thinking about it. You were right. No one should live like a doormat. Not even me." The words lodged in my throat. My mother, who had spent decades smoothing over Dad's temper, who had told me 1,000 times to let things go, was now saying this. My eyes stung and I reached for her hand. "I never wanted you to feel like I didn't see you," she whispered. "But I think I was afraid. Afraid of your father, afraid of conflict, afraid of what would happen if I stopped playing the peacemaker. And I let that fear cost you so much." I squeezed her hand. "Mom, hearing you say this means more than you know." She smiled weakly, tears glistening. "You gave me courage, Rachel. You taught me it's never too late to start over." She pulled the folder from beside her purse and showed me the enrollment papers, the class schedule. "It won't be easy, but it's for me this time. Just me." I sat back, overwhelmed. For so long I had carried the weight of being unseen, and here was my mother choosing to see herself, and me, in a new light. For the first time, I felt like I had an ally inside my own family. As weeks passed, the ripple effects of the wedding kept spreading. Dad's reputation in his business circles began to slip. I overheard one of his old partners, Roger, telling someone at a barbecue, "Edward's temper gets the best of him. Can't even keep his own family together. Contracts dried up. People stopped calling." He puffed himself up in public, but at home he grew restless, snapping at my mother, more often sulking when the phone stayed silent. Christopher, too, hit his wall. After the disastrous client gala, his firm passed him over for partnership consideration. I heard from a cousin who worked in the same building that the partners were deeply disappointed. He walked through the halls, with his head down, no longer the rising star. When I saw him at a family gathering months later, his suit looked a little looser, his smile forced. Allison tried to keep her perfect image intact, but cracks were showing. With no one to fall back on, she was juggling night shifts, 2 kids and a husband who seemed more absent with each passing week. At Thanksgiving, she showed up late, hair frizzed, snapping at Emma for spilling juice. I watched her, remembering all the times I had quietly cleaned up those spills while she basked in praise. Now the exhaustion was hers to carry. Karma had come not in some dramatic crash, but in slow, grinding ways. Each of them was forced to live without me propping them up. And for once I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. One night in September, I sat on my condo balcony with David, watching the city lights flicker against the lake. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from Mom. Got my first A on a midterm. Just thought you'd want to know. I showed it to David, smiling through the tears that welled in my eyes. She's really doing it, I whispered. He kissed the side of my head. You changed the whole story of your family, Rachel. And you didn't even have to fight them. You just had to stop letting them use you. I leaned into him, feeling the night air on my face, and thought about how different things had become. Not perfect, not healed, but different. And for the first time, justice didn't look like revenge. It looked like the truth finally catching up with all of them, while I stood steady in my own life, smiling at the quiet fairness of it all. A year later, I sat by the window of my new condo in Lakeview, the afternoon sun painting stripes across the hardwood floors. The city buzzed below, but inside everything felt calm. My life no longer revolved around phone calls that began with Rachel. Can you? Or family emergencies that only I seemed qualified to handle. I had carved out space for myself, and I was finally living in it. Work had flourished. At Westview Tech, I was leading a full team launching campaigns that drew attention across the industry. My name was being mentioned in rooms I had never dreamed of entering. I traveled for conferences, met with executives who valued my expertise, and came home at night to someone who respected me for who I was, not what I could do for him. David and I had settled into a rhythm. Weekend hikes, quiet dinners, laughter that filled the corners of my once lonely apartment. But family, no matter how fractured, never fully disappears. The call came in early spring, a shaky voice on the other end. Christopher told me Dad had suffered a mild heart attack. He's going to be okay, he said quickly. Doctors say it wasn't severe, but he's different now. He wants to see you. I felt the old instinct rising, the rush to drop everything, to drive across town to fix. But I stayed seated, hand pressed over my chest, as I asked the only question that mattered. Is he stable? Yes, Christopher replied, almost defensive. He'll recover. Then you and Allison can handle it, I said softly. I'll decide when I'm ready. Weeks later, Mom called. Her voice was gentler than I'd ever known. Rachel, your father's been going to therapy. He's trying. He asked me to ask you if you'd meet him, just once to talk. I thought about it long and hard. Old wounds don't heal overnight. But something in me knew I needed to hear what he had to say. Not for him, but for myself. We met at a coffee shop in Oak Park, a neutral place where neither of us had history. He looked smaller, somehow older, his hair grayer, his shoulders hunched. He didn't start with excuses. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, I treated you like a servant in your own family. I took you for granted, and I humiliated you. Calling you a doormat. It was cruel, and I'm ashamed. I studied his face, waiting for the defensiveness I had grown up with, the dismissive jokes. But there were none. Just a man, stripped of pride, staring into the wreckage he had helped create. I'm not here to pretend everything's fine, I said firmly. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be built on respect. I won't be diminished again. I won't let you erase me. His eyes watered. I understand. I want to do better. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I don't want to leave this world without trying to fix what I broke. It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. For the first time, I felt I had the power to set the terms. Later that evening, back at my condo, I told David everything. He held me close, whispering, You don't owe him anything, Rachel. But if you choose to let him back in, it's on your terms. That's what matters. I nodded, realizing he was right. For the first time in my life, the choice was mine. As the seasons turned, the family dynamic shifted. Christopher stayed distant, nursing his bruised ego after being passed over at the firm. Allison still juggled too much, but she no longer called me for help. And Mom was thriving. She had completed her certification, started working at a financial planning office, and carried herself with a confidence I had never seen before. Sometimes we'd meet for lunch downtown, two women finally free of the roles that had chained us for decades. One night, sitting on my balcony with the city lights spread out before me, I thought back to that ballroom a year earlier. The microphone heavy in my hand, the silence pressing down the word doormat echoing in my head. I remembered how it felt to finally speak, to finally rise up and claim my voice. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, I was their doormat once. But not anymore. I stood up, and now they see me, not beneath them, not beneath their feet, but as someone they have to face. That was the truth I wanted to carry forward. Not revenge, not bitterness, but clarity. My worth was never theirs to define. And if you've ever been made to feel small, overlooked, or treated like you didn't matter, tell me how you stood up. Share your story, because sometimes the moment we rise is the moment we finally teach others how to see us. And your story might just give someone else the courage to rise too.